"You're my biggest mistake. I wish I could forget I ever had you," Margaret Brooks screamed across the dining table, her voice slicing through the warm Sunday air of the old colonial house in Dayton, Ohio. And for a moment no one moved, not her grandson Daniel, who still held his iced tea halfway to his lips, not Linda, who stared down at her untouched green beans, and not Eleanor Brooks, 68 years old, widow, mother, daughter, who sat perfectly still at the head of the table she had set, with her best white china, as if nothing at all had just happened. The words hung there heavier than the July humidity pressing against the windows, and Eleanor did not cry, she did not argue, she did not even blink right away. She simply folded her linen napkin once, then twice, and placed it beside her plate with a care that felt almost ceremonial. Margaret's hands were trembling, but not with regret, only with the restless agitation that had followed her for decades. The same sharp energy that had filled every holiday, every birthday, every milestone with a subtle tension Eleanor had long ago learned to manage. The roast chicken in the center of the table had already gone lukewarm, the butter on the corn had begun to harden again, and the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly enough to sound like a second heartbeat in the house. Daniel cleared his throat as if he might say something, but the sound died before it formed into words, and Linda reached for her phone without realizing she had done it, as though distraction might soften what had just been said. Eleanor finally lifted her eyes to her mother's face, and there was no fury there, no wounded pleading, only a stillness that made Margaret falter for the briefest second. Margaret had always been a force in the room, the kind of woman who corrected waiters, rearranged furniture in other people's homes, and reminded everyone within earshot how much she had sacrificed in her life. And for years she had woven a narrative in which Eleanor was the disappointment, the sensitive one, the child who had cost her sleep, money, opportunity, youth. Even now at 87, Margaret carried herself like a judge passing sentence, her silver hair pulled tight into a bun, her thin cardigan buttoned all the way to the collar. Despite the 83-degree afternoon, Eleanor rose from her chair slowly, smoothing the front of her pale blue blouse, and the simple act of standing seemed to quiet the entire room. No one reached for her, no one apologized, and Margaret, perhaps expecting a defensive outburst, instead found herself staring at her daughter's calm profile. Eleanor walked toward the kitchen, the hardwood floor cool beneath her feet, and the sound of the faucet turning on felt almost peaceful. She rinsed her hands, even though they were clean, dried them carefully, and looked out the window toward the backyard where the maple tree cast long shadows across the grass. Inside her chest something had shifted, not broken, not shattered, but settled into a clarity she had not known before. The sentence her mother had thrown at her was not new in spirit, only in volume. Margaret had whispered variations of it for decades in more polite tones, disguised as concern or discipline, but today she had finally said it plainly, and in doing so she had given Eleanor something unexpected: certainty. When Eleanor returned to the dining room, she did not sit back down. She glanced once at Daniel, whose eyes flickered with confusion, and once at Linda, who seemed suddenly unsure where to look, and then she met her mother's gaze again. Margaret's jaw was set, defiant, as though daring her daughter to protest. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest, almost polite smile. She did not defend her existence, she did not list her achievements, she did not remind anyone that the house they were sitting in had been purchased with her savings or that the property taxes were paid from her account. She simply said in a voice so steady it barely carried emotion, "Dinner's over," and walked toward the front door. The screen creaked as she stepped onto the porch, the late afternoon sun warm against her skin, and behind her the house remained quiet, as if the walls themselves were listening. Margaret believed she had just erased her daughter with a sentence, but as Eleanor stood on that porch breathing in the scent of freshly cut grass and distant barbecue smoke from a neighbor's yard, she understood something her mother did not: erasure works both ways. And for the first time in 68 years, Eleanor Brooks was no longer afraid of being forgotten. The front door closed behind Eleanor with a soft click that sounded far louder in her mind than it did in the quiet neighborhood, and she stood on the porch for a long moment, her hand still resting on the brass handle as if she were deciding whether she had truly meant to step outside or if this was simply another pause in a familiar pattern. The late afternoon sun dipped lower over the rooftops of Dayton, casting long shadows across Maple Street, and somewhere down the block a lawnmower hummed steadily, ordinary and indifferent to what had just unfolded inside her home. She walked down the 3 wooden steps carefully, feeling the grain of the railing beneath her palm, and moved toward the driveway where her silver sedan sat beneath a thin layer of pollen. She did not rush because rushing would have implied panic, and there was no panic in her chest, only a cool and unfamiliar steadiness. Inside the house, through the open dining room window, she could faintly hear Margaret's voice again, sharper now. Asking Daniel why he had not said anything, asking Linda why she was staring at her phone, as if the silence of others were an offense equal to the words she had spoken. Eleanor did not turn back. She opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed it gently, sealing herself into a space that felt, for the first time in years, entirely her own. She rested her hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine and allowed her breathing to slow. She had spent most of her life reacting, smoothing arguments, offering explanations, apologizing for things she had not done simply to keep peace within walls that never truly felt peaceful. She remembered being 10 years old, standing in a similar kitchen while her mother complained that Eleanor had ruined an afternoon by asking too many questions. She remembered being 23, newly married, hearing Margaret sigh heavily at the wedding reception and remark that some daughters were simply born difficult. She remembered being 45, bringing homemade soup to her mother during flu season only to be told that it tasted too salty and that nothing Eleanor did was ever quite right. The pattern was so old that it had once felt like weather, something that could not be changed, only endured. But today, in the bright heat of a Midwestern summer afternoon, the pattern had shifted. Eleanor started the engine and pulled slowly out of the driveway, not because she had a destination in mind but because motion felt necessary. She drove past the elementary school where Daniel had once played on the swings, past the grocery store where she had carefully compared prices when money had been tight after her husband passed away, past the small brick church where she still attended service every Sunday. She realized with a clarity that surprised her that every major memory of her adulthood had contained her mother's voice in some form, advising, criticizing, correcting. At a red light she glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror and saw a woman with silver threaded through her brown hair, fine lines around her eyes, and an expression that no longer looked uncertain. The light turned green and she drove toward the river park where she sometimes walked in the mornings. She parked beneath a row of sycamore trees and stepped out into the warm breeze that carried the scent of water and freshly cut grass. Families sat at picnic tables, children chased each other across the lawn, and life continued with steady normalcy. Eleanor walked along the paved path for nearly half a mile, her sensible shoes tapping softly against the concrete, and with each step she felt the echo of her mother's words growing less sharp and more distant, as if they belonged to a chapter already closing. She did not cry, instead she began to inventory the facts of her life with practical precision. The house was in her name, the utilities were paid from her account, the savings she and her late husband had built were still intact, and Margaret's dependence on her was far greater than anyone at that dinner table had ever acknowledged. For years she had believed that enduring harshness was a form of loyalty, that remaining close despite constant criticism proved strength. Now she saw something different. Endurance without boundaries was not strength but surrender. She stopped at a bench overlooking the slow-moving river and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. The water reflected the fading sunlight in quiet ripples, and she understood that what had happened at the dinner table was not an explosion but a revelation. Her mother had spoken with the honesty of exhaustion, and in doing so had removed the last illusion Eleanor had been holding onto. There would be no apology later that evening, no softened explanation about stress or misunderstanding. Margaret believed what she had said. Eleanor rose from the bench after several minutes and looked toward the parking lot where her car waited. She had not decided on every detail of what would come next, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not return to that dining table as the same woman who had left it, and whatever actions followed would not be loud, dramatic, or cruel. They would be measured, lawful, and final, shaped not by anger but by clarity that had taken 68 years to arrive. By the time Eleanor drove back toward Maple Street, the sky had softened into the pale gold of early evening and the neighborhood looked unchanged, as if words had not been thrown like stones inside the colonial house with the white shutters. She turned into her driveway and noticed Daniel's pickup truck was gone, which did not surprise her, because he had never been comfortable sitting inside conflict, and Linda's small blue sedan was no longer parked at the curb. Only Margaret's presence remained as steady and immovable as the brick foundation beneath the house. Eleanor turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal, and she considered how many times she had returned to this driveway over the years feeling smaller than when she left. Tonight felt different. She stepped out, walked up the path lined with neatly trimmed hostas, and entered through the front door without hesitation. The dining room had been cleared, the plates stacked, In the sink, the smell of reheated coffee lingering faintly in the air. Margaret was seated in the living room armchair near the lamp with the beige shade, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. The television was on but muted, captions scrolling across the bottom of the screen. When Eleanor walked in, Margaret did not look up immediately. She waited as if expecting her daughter to speak first. Eleanor removed her shoes and placed them neatly by the door, then crossed the room and stood opposite the armchair. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for an apology. She simply said, "I will not accept that from you," and the sentence felt firm. Without being loud, Margaret scoffed softly and finally lifted her gaze, her eyes sharp despite their age. She began to explain that she had been tired, that she had been frustrated, that people said things in the heat of the moment, but even as she spoke, her tone carried more justification than regret. Eleanor listened without interruption, noticing how familiar the pattern was: deflect, rationalize, reposition. She realized that for decades she had rushed to repair moments like this, offering comfort to the very person who had wounded her, eager to restore harmony even if it meant swallowing her own hurt. Tonight she did none of those things. She waited until Margaret's words tapered off into a brittle silence. "You meant it," Eleanor said quietly, not as an accusation but as an observation. Margaret's chin lifted in defiance. "I have sacrificed everything for you," she replied as she always did, invoking a ledger of motherhood that seemed forever unbalanced. Eleanor nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement of the narrative her mother had repeated her entire life. "You have lived here for 9 years, Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "After my husband passed away, I asked you to move in so you would not be alone. I pay the property taxes. I pay the utilities. I manage the repairs. I have never asked you for gratitude." Margaret shifted in her chair, unsettled by the calm recitation of facts. Eleanor was not arguing emotion, she was stating structure. "I did not bring you here to be told I should not exist," she added, and for the first time there was a trace of steel in her tone. Margaret's eyes flickered, perhaps recognizing that something fundamental had shifted. She attempted another familiar defense, suggesting that Eleanor was too sensitive, that other daughters would have laughed it off, that family. Words did not count. Eleanor shook her head gently. "Words count," she said. "They always have." The room felt smaller, the air heavier, yet Eleanor did not feel trapped. Instead she felt anchored, as if she were finally standing on solid ground after years of shifting sand. She walked to the bookshelf and picked up the framed photograph of her late husband, Thomas, smiling beside her on a beach vacation in Florida many summers ago. She studied it briefly, then set it back in place. "I am going to make some changes," she said, turning back toward her mother. Margaret frowned, suspicious. "What changes?" she demanded. Eleanor did not elaborate. She did not threaten or dramatize. "Necessary ones," she replied. She then moved toward the hallway, her footsteps even and unhurried, and closed the door to her bedroom behind her. Inside, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small desk where a folder of financial documents rested neatly organized. For years she had kept everything in order out of habit. Now that order would serve a new purpose. She reached for her phone, scrolled to a contact saved months ago after a church seminar on estate planning, and read the name quietly to herself. Michael Harris, attorney at law. She did not call yet. She simply looked at the screen, aware that this next step would not be emotional or impulsive. It would be deliberate. Outside her bedroom door she could hear the faint murmur of the television, and the occasional creak of Margaret shifting in her chair. Life continued inside the house as if nothing monumental had occurred. But Eleanor knew that something irreversible had begun. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with a boundary spoken clearly and a decision forming in the quiet of her own room. The bedroom felt quieter than the rest of the house, as if the walls themselves understood that decisions were forming within it, and Eleanor remained seated at her small oak desk long after the hallway television had gone silent. The clock on her nightstand read 9:47 in steady red numbers, and she noticed that her hands were no longer trembling. Instead they rested calmly on the folder that contained the mortgage statement, the property deed, the insurance policy, and the updated bank summary she reviewed every quarter. She opened the folder and began to read through each page slowly, not because she did not know the contents, but because she wanted to see them with fresh eyes. The house on Maple Street had been purchased 32 years ago, long before Margaret ever crossed its threshold with 2 suitcases and a quiet insistence that she could not live alone anymore. Eleanor remembered the afternoon her mother had arrived after Thomas passed away, standing on the porch with a forced fragility that masked the same commanding presence she had always carried. At the time, Eleanor had believed bringing her mother into the home was an act of kindness, a way to ensure that neither of them would sit alone in grief. She had not foreseen how quickly kindness could turn into control. Over the years, Margaret had rearranged the kitchen cabinets, criticized the landscaping, corrected how the towels were folded, and gradually positioned herself as the authority within walls she did not own. Eleanor had allowed it, telling herself that aging required patience and that family demanded sacrifice. She reached for her phone and scrolled once more to Michael Harris's contact information. She had met him at a church workshop about estate planning 6 months earlier, when he had spoken calmly about the importance of clarity in later years, about ensuring that property and finances reflected intention rather than assumption. At the time she had taken notes politely and filed his business card into the desk drawer without urgency. Now she understood why that conversation had stayed with her. She pressed the call button and listened as the line rang twice before going to voicemail. His recorded greeting was professional and steady. She left a message in an even tone, stating her name, her address, and that she would like to schedule a consultation regarding property and living arrangements. She did not explain the emotional catalyst. She did not need to. After ending the call, she felt neither relief nor anxiety, only a sense of alignment, as if the action matched the clarity forming inside her. Outside her bedroom door she heard Margaret's footsteps moving slowly toward the kitchen, the familiar creak of the refrigerator opening, the clink of a glass placed on the counter. Life in the house continued in ordinary rhythms. Eleanor stood and walked to the window overlooking the backyard. The maple tree cast long shadows under the porch light, and the grass glowed faintly under the soft yellow beam. She realized that for years she had structured her routines around minimizing friction, adjusting her schedule to avoid conflict, lowering her voice to prevent escalation. She had believed that peace required shrinking. Tonight she saw that peace required structure. She returned to her desk and pulled out a legal pad, writing down a simple list. Property ownership, financial contributions, residency terms, timeline. The words looked stark in black ink against the yellow paper, but they steadied her. She knew that whatever changes she made would not be punitive or impulsive. They would be defined, documented, and lawful. She thought of Daniel and Linda, of how easily silence had filled the dining room earlier, and she understood that their discomfort had been shaped by years of watching a dynamic they did not fully question. She did not resent them. She simply recognized that no one else would correct what had been normalized for decades. The phone buzzed softly in her hand, startling her. It was a text message from Daniel asking if she had arrived home safely. She read it once and typed a brief response saying that she was home and resting. She did not mention the consultation she had just requested. She did not need to justify a boundary before it was even set. The house felt still again as she placed the phone on the desk. Margaret's bedroom door closed down the hall with a quiet thud, signaling the end of the evening's movement. Eleanor turned off her lamp and lay down on her bed, fully aware that tomorrow would not look dramatic from the outside. There would be breakfast, coffee, perhaps a polite exchange in the hallway. But beneath the surface, a recalibration had begun. She no longer saw herself as the child seeking approval from an impossible standard. She saw herself as the homeowner, the decision-maker, the adult whose generosity had been mistaken for obligation. And as she closed her eyes, she understood that whatever came next would not be loud or cruel. It would simply be firm, and firmness, she realized, was something she had earned. Morning arrived with a pale gray light filtering through the curtains, and Eleanor woke before her alarm, her mind clear rather than restless. For a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the faint ticking of the hallway clock, and she noticed that the tightness she once carried in her chest after arguments was absent. She dressed carefully in a cream blouse and pressed slacks, choosing clothes that made her feel composed rather than defensive. And when she stepped into the kitchen she found Margaret already seated at the table with a mug of black coffee, the newspaper spread open in front of her. The air felt polite but fragile, like thin glass. "Good morning," Eleanor said evenly, moving toward the counter to prepare her own cup. Margaret responded with a small nod that carried neither apology nor hostility, only guarded pride. They existed in the same space without reference to the previous evening, and Eleanor understood that silence had always been Margaret's method of resetting the board, as if ignoring the fracture made it disappear. Eleanor stirred sugar into her coffee slowly and then turned to face her mother. "I have an appointment this afternoon," she said. Margaret glanced up briefly. "For what?" she asked, suspicion threading her tone. Legal consultation, Eleanor replied. The words landed gently but firmly. Margaret's hand tightened around her mug. What for? She pressed. Eleanor met her gaze without blinking. To review the structure of this house and the arrangements inside it, she answered. Margaret scoffed lightly and folded the newspaper with deliberate force. You are overreacting, she said. Families do not run to lawyers over words. Eleanor placed her spoon in the sink and dried her hands on a clean towel. Families also do not tell their daughters they should not exist, she replied calmly. Margaret's eyes flashed, but she did not respond. The clock on the microwave read 7:25. Outside, a school bus rolled past, brakes hissing softly as children climbed aboard. Life moved forward without commentary. Eleanor gathered her purse and keys. I will be back before dinner, she said, not as a courtesy but as a statement of schedule. Margaret did not answer. She stared instead at the table as if considering how to reclaim ground she had not realized she was losing. Eleanor drove across town to a small brick office building near the courthouse, where a modest sign read Harris & Cole, attorneys at law. She parked in a marked visitor space and sat for a brief second before stepping out. The air smelled faintly of asphalt warming under the sun. Inside, the waiting room was quiet, with neutral carpeting and framed photographs of the Dayton skyline. Michael Harris emerged from his office precisely at 1:30 in the afternoon, extending his hand in greeting. He was in his early 50s, composed, with kind but observant eyes. Mrs. Brooks, it is good to see you again, he said. Eleanor returned the handshake steadily. Inside his office she explained the facts without dramatization. The property deed listed her as sole owner. The mortgage had been paid off 5 years earlier. Her mother resided in the home without a formal lease agreement. She outlined the financial contributions she made monthly for utilities, groceries, and medical insurance supplements. Michael listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he leaned back slightly. What would you like to change? He asked. Eleanor did not hesitate. I would like clear terms, she said. I would like the house protected in a trust for my son, with specific residency conditions attached. I would like written notice required for any occupant who does not hold ownership. Michael nodded thoughtfully. That is entirely possible, he replied. It would formalize what is currently informal. Eleanor felt no surge of anger, only alignment. I am not trying to punish anyone, she added. I am correcting an assumption. Michael offered a measured smile. Boundaries often look harsh to those who benefited from their absence, he said. They discussed timelines, documentation, and the necessary filings. The conversation was procedural, grounded, devoid of emotion. When Eleanor left the office with a folder of preliminary documents in her purse, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This was not an act of retaliation. It was an act of clarity. As she drove back toward Maple Street, passing the courthouse steps and the rows of modest suburban homes, she realized that the power shift had already begun. Nothing dramatic had occurred, no raised voices or slammed doors. Instead, a series of lawful decisions had been set in motion. And in the stillness of her car, with the afternoon sun casting steady light across the dashboard, Eleanor understood that sometimes the coldest action was simply the most organized one. When Eleanor pulled into the driveway that afternoon, the house looked exactly as it had that morning, white shutters steady against the brick, curtains drawn halfway to keep out the late summer heat, but she understood that structure and stability were no longer the same thing. She stepped inside carrying the thin folder Michael Harris had given her, the papers resting flat against her side as if they weighed nothing at all. Margaret was in the kitchen slicing apples with deliberate precision, the blade tapping against the wooden cutting board in a steady rhythm. She glanced up as Eleanor entered, her expression guarded. You were gone a long time, Margaret said. It was a thorough conversation, Eleanor replied evenly. She sat her purse on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, the faucet running cool over the ice cubes. There was no accusation in her tone, no dramatic pause, only quiet forward movement. Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter. You really went through with it, she said. It was not a question. Eleanor met her eyes. Yes, she answered. Margaret exhaled sharply. After everything I have done for you, she began, but Eleanor lifted her hand gently. This is not about the past, she said. It is about the present structure of this home. Margaret frowned as if structure were an insult. Eleanor continued, her voice calm. The house will be placed in a trust under my name with Daniel designated as beneficiary. Residency terms will be written clearly. Expenses will be documented. There will be no more assumptions. The words were spoken without anger, but they landed with unmistakable weight. Margaret straightened, her posture stiff. "You are threatening me," she said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I am clarifying ownership." The apple slices remained untouched on the board. The kitchen felt smaller, the hum of the refrigerator louder. Margaret looked toward the window as if searching for support beyond the glass. "I am your mother," she said. "I should not need terms to live with my own daughter." Eleanor allowed the statement to settle. "And I am your daughter," she replied. "I should not be told that my life was a mistake." While standing in my own dining room, the silence that followed was not explosive. It was dense. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, whether from age or indignation Eleanor could not tell. "You would put me out at my age?" Margaret asked. The question carried an undercurrent of disbelief. Eleanor answered steadily. "No, I am not removing you. I am defining expectations. The trust will include a life residency clause provided that mutual respect is maintained. If that condition is broken, alternative housing arrangements will be considered." Margaret stared at her, absorbing the unfamiliar language of conditions and clauses. For years, emotional dominance had governed their interactions. Now legal clarity stood in its place. Eleanor picked up the folder and placed it on the kitchen table. "The documents will be drafted within the week," she said. "You will have a copy." Margaret lowered herself into a chair slowly, as if the room had shifted beneath her. She was not accustomed to frameworks she did not design. "Daniel will not support this," she said after a moment. Eleanor's expression did not change. "Daniel does not own this house," she answered. Outside, a car passed down Maple Street, tires whispering against the pavement. The world beyond the kitchen window continued without interruption. Margaret's voice softened slightly. "You are being cold," she said. Eleanor considered the word. Cold had once meant unfeeling to her, now it meant controlled. "I am being clear," she replied. She gathered the apple slices and placed them neatly on a plate, setting it in front of her mother as she had done countless times before. The gesture was simple, almost tender, but it no longer carried surrender. Margaret looked at the plate and then back at her daughter, searching perhaps for the old hesitation, the quick apology, the attempt to smooth edges. None appeared. Eleanor moved toward the hallway, pausing only long enough to say, "Dinner will be at 6. Her tone was steady, domestic, unchanged on the surface. Yet beneath it lay a structure that would not dissolve overnight. In her bedroom she placed the folder in the desk drawer and locked it gently. She did not feel triumphant. She felt anchored. For decades, authority in the house had been emotional and unpredictable. Now it was documented and measurable. As the late afternoon light stretched across the hardwood floor, Eleanor understood that firmness did not require raised voices. It required follow-through. And for the first time in many years, she was prepared to follow through without hesitation. The days that followed did not explode into chaos. Instead they unfolded with a careful tension that settled into the corners of the house like dust that refused to be swept away. Margaret moved through the kitchen with measured restraint, her footsteps slower, her remarks fewer, yet beneath the quiet Eleanor sensed calculation. On Wednesday afternoon Daniel arrived unannounced. His pickup truck pulling into the driveway with a decisive crunch of gravel. Eleanor was in the living room reviewing a bank statement when she heard the front door open and close. Daniel entered with a tight expression, the kind he wore when he had rehearsed a conversation during the drive. "Mom," he began, standing near the doorway rather than sitting down. "Grandma told me you are changing the house arrangement." Eleanor folded the statement once and placed it on the coffee table. "Yes," she said. There was no defensiveness in her tone. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "She is upset," he continued. "She thinks you are pushing her out." Eleanor looked at her son carefully, noting the strain around his eyes. "I am not pushing anyone out," she replied. "I am formalizing ownership and expectations." Daniel shifted his weight. "It just feels sudden," he said. Eleanor allowed a small pause. Before answering, "It is not sudden," she said. "It is overdue." The room fell quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. Daniel glanced toward the hallway, where Margaret's bedroom door remained closed. "She says you are punishing her," he added. Eleanor rose from the sofa and walked to the mantel, adjusting the framed photograph of Thomas so it stood straight. "I am protecting what your father and I built," she said evenly. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly. "I do not want this family divided," he admitted. Eleanor turned to face him fully. "Division happens when truth is ignored," she said. "Structure prevents resentment." Daniel looked conflicted, caught between loyalty to his grandmother and respect for his mother. What exactly are you changing? He asked. Eleanor explained the trust arrangement, the residency clause, the requirement of mutual respect as a condition of continued residence. She described it not as an ultimatum but as a safeguard. Daniel listened without interruption this time. So she can stay? He asked quietly. Yes, Eleanor replied. As long as the home remains respectful. Daniel exhaled slowly. She is afraid, he said. Eleanor nodded once. So was I, she answered. The words settled between them with unexpected weight. For years Daniel had witnessed subtle criticisms, small remarks that chipped away at his mother's confidence, yet he had categorized them as generational differences rather than harm. Now he seemed to be reassessing. I should have said something at dinner, he admitted after a moment. Eleanor did not scold him. You will have other chances to speak, she said. The statement carried neither bitterness nor blame. It simply acknowledged growth. From the hallway came the faint sound of a door opening. Margaret appeared slowly, her posture upright despite the tension in her eyes. I did not realize we were holding meetings about me, she said sharply. Daniel turned toward her, uncertain. Eleanor. Step forward, her voice calm. We are not holding meetings about you, she replied. We are discussing the house. Margaret's gaze shifted between them. You are turning my grandson against me, she accused. Eleanor did not raise her voice. No one is against you, she said. This is about clarity. Margaret's lips pressed thin. You have changed, she said. Eleanor met her stare. Yes, she answered simply. There was no further explanation. No apology. Daniel looked from one woman to the other and seemed to recognize that the dynamic he had always known had altered. Margaret retreated to the hallway without another word. Her steps measured but unsettled. The front door remained open behind Daniel, letting in a narrow beam of late afternoon sunlight that cut across the floorboards. Eleanor walked to the door and closed it gently. I am not trying to win, she said quietly to her son. I am trying to be steady. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand, he said. Whether he fully did or not, Eleanor could not be certain, but she saw in his expression a new awareness. After he left, the house returned to its layered quiet. Margaret stayed in her room longer than usual that evening, emerging only for a brief glass of water. Eleanor prepared dinner at 6 as promised, placing 2 plates on the table without commentary. The routine remained intact, but beneath it ran a new foundation, one built not on emotional endurance but on defined lines. And as Eleanor sat across from her mother, in measured silence, she understood that firmness did not fracture a home. It revealed which parts had been unstable all along. By the end of the week, the house on Maple Street no longer felt uncertain. It felt quiet in a way that suggested recalibration rather than peace, and Eleanor moved through her routines with deliberate steadiness. On Friday morning she received a call from Michael Harris confirming that the preliminary trust documents were drafted and ready for review. He explained the clauses clearly, including the life residency condition tied to mutual respect, and the formal notice requirement for any violation of that condition. Eleanor thanked him and scheduled a signing appointment for the following Tuesday. When she ended the call, she remained seated at the kitchen table, sunlight falling across the wood grain, and allowed herself a moment to absorb the finality of what she was setting in motion. Across from her, Margaret sat reading a magazine, her posture tight, as if waiting for a tremor that never came. Was that the lawyer? Margaret asked without looking up. Yes, Eleanor answered. There was no need to elaborate. Margaret closed the magazine slowly and placed it on the table. You are serious about this, she said. Eleanor nodded once. I am consistent about this, she replied. Margaret's lips pressed together. You would put legal language between a mother and daughter, she said. Eleanor's voice remained even. There has always been language between us. This is simply clearer. Margaret stared at her for several seconds, perhaps expecting anger to surface. None did. Instead she saw something far more unsettling, calm. Over the next few days Margaret's tone softened in small, almost rehearsed ways. She complimented the way Eleanor folded laundry, thanked her for making oatmeal instead of toast, asked polite questions about the weather. The gestures were subtle but deliberate. Eleanor noticed them without reacting strongly. She understood that temporary gentleness did not erase years of imbalance. She responded kindly but did not retract a single decision. On Sunday afternoon Daniel visited again, this time with a quieter demeanor. He sat at the kitchen table while Eleanor reviewed the trust summary with him, explaining each clause in clear, patient language. He listened carefully and eventually nodded. It makes sense, he said. It protects everyone. Eleanor appreciated the phrasing. Protection was not punishment. It was prevention. Margaret remained in the living room during the conversation, the television volume low, yet her attention clearly fixed on every word. When Daniel left, she emerged slowly. "You have always been stubborn," she said, not unkindly. Eleanor met her gaze. "I have always been patient," she corrected. The distinction lingered. Tuesday arrived with a mild breeze and bright sky, and Eleanor drove once more to the brick office near the courthouse. She signed the documents with a steady hand. Each stroke of the pen measured. Michael Harris notarized the pages and explained the next procedural steps. When she walked back to her car holding the sealed envelope, she felt neither victory nor loss. She felt alignment. Back at the house, Margaret was seated at the dining table where the week before harsh words had echoed. Eleanor placed a copy of the trust summary in front of her. "This is for you," she said. Margaret glanced at the papers but did not immediately touch them. "So this is how it ends," she murmured. Eleanor considered the phrasing. "This is how it stabilizes," she replied. Margaret finally lifted the document, her hands less steady than before. She read in silence, her eyes moving slowly across the printed lines. There were no threats on the page, only structure. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at her daughter in a way she had not in years. There was no superiority in her expression now, only the faint recognition that authority had shifted. "I did not think you would ever draw a line," she said quietly. Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Neither did I." The admission was simple and unadorned. The kitchen felt still, the late afternoon light warm against the countertops. Outside, a neighbor walked his dog along the sidewalk, unaware of the recalibration that had taken place inside the colonial house. Margaret did not argue further. She did not apologize either. Instead, she folded the document carefully and placed it beside her plate as if acknowledging its permanence. Eleanor returned to the sink and began washing a single coffee mug, the water running steady and clear. She understood that change rarely arrived with applause or dramatic collapse. It arrived through signatures, clauses, and calm follow-through. And as the dish towel moved slowly across the ceramic surface, she recognized that what had begun as a wound had become a boundary, and boundaries, once established, do not need to shout to remain firm. Autumn arrived quietly in Dayton, the maple leaves in the backyard shifting from green to shades of amber and red. And with the change in season, the house on Maple Street settled into a new rhythm that felt measured rather than tense. Weeks had passed since the trust documents were signed, filed, and confirmed, and the structure Eleanor established had begun to shape daily life in subtle but unmistakable ways. Margaret no longer rearranged cabinets or commented on how towels were folded. She asked before inviting church acquaintances over for afternoon coffee. She spoke carefully, as if testing the weight of each word before releasing it into the air. Eleanor noticed the change but did not celebrate it. She simply maintained consistency. One evening in late October, as the temperature dipped to 58 degrees and a light breeze moved across the porch, Margaret stood by the living room window watching children in the neighborhood carry pumpkins up their driveways. "I suppose I underestimated you," she said quietly without turning around. Eleanor was seated in the armchair opposite, reviewing a small notebook where she tracked household expenses. She lifted her eyes calmly. "You underestimated my limits," she replied. Margaret nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The admission did not come with apology, but it carried something closer to recognition. The distance between them no longer felt like a battleground, it felt like space. Daniel visited more frequently during those weeks, sometimes bringing Linda and occasionally staying long enough for dinner. He no longer sat in uneasy silence. If Margaret made a sharp remark, he gently redirected the conversation. The dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation but through example. Eleanor's steadiness had given him language he had not known how to use before. One Sunday afternoon, as golden light filtered through the dining room curtains, Margaret approached the table where Eleanor was arranging a simple vase of fresh chrysanthemums. "You are not my mistake," Margaret said, her voice low and restrained. The sentence hung between them. Eleanor did not rush to fill the silence. She did not soften it with reassurance. She simply met her mother's gaze and allowed the words to exist. "I should not have said that," Margaret added after a moment. The apology was imperfect, lacking elaboration or emotional flourish, but it was direct. Eleanor felt no surge of vindication. She felt something quieter, something closer to closure. "Thank you," she said evenly. There was no dramatic embrace, no collapse of years into tears. There was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was enough. That evening, after Margaret retired to her room, Eleanor stepped onto the back porch with a light cardigan around her shoulders. The air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and, distant with smoke, she looked up at the sky, now darker earlier in the season, and thought about the arc of her own life. She had spent decades believing endurance was loyalty and silence was peace. She now understood that peace without boundaries was only postponement. The house behind her stood unchanged in appearance, but its foundation felt different. Ownership had always been hers on paper. Now it was hers in posture. Inside, the hallway light glowed softly beneath Margaret's door, and Eleanor knew that age would continue to bring its own vulnerabilities and adjustments. The trust did not erase compassion, it framed it. Weeks later, as the first frost settled lightly over the lawn, Eleanor received confirmation that all filings were complete and recorded. She placed the official copy in her desk drawer and locked it, not out of secrecy but out of order. When Daniel stopped by that evening, he looked around the living room and smiled faintly. "It feels calmer here," he said. Eleanor glanced toward the window where Margaret sat knitting quietly. "It is clearer here," she replied. Margaret did not look up, but the corners of her mouth softened. There were no more declarations about regret or erasure. There were ordinary conversations about grocery lists, church schedules, and the upcoming holidays. The transformation had not been loud or theatrical. It had been procedural and firm. And as Eleanor turned off the kitchen lights that night and walked down the hallway to her bedroom, she understood that the coldest action she had taken was not revenge. It was the refusal to accept a narrative that diminished her. In choosing structure over submission, she had not erased her mother. She had erased the imbalance. And in doing so, she had rewritten the quiet rules of the house without raising her voice even once.